Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hello there, and welcome to episode 93 of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another story. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First off, please take a second to rate, review, subscribe, or follow TheKillFile wherever you're getting your podcast fix for the newest episodes every Monday. It's one of the best ways to support the podcast, and it only takes a moment. Next, check out the website at TheKillFile.com, where you can find various things like a little background on how TheKillFile got started, a section where you can submit a case that you'd like me to cover, a forum to share your own true crime stories for a chance for it to be read on the bonus content, and also you can find the merch shop. Some new t-shirts are being added for this spring. I would say check those out if you're looking for some fun and funny true crime gear. I sport mine all the time to help spread the word, and they're a fun conversation starter. The shirt that I personally get complimented on the most, and that makes so many people laugh, surprisingly, older people, the most, is the Fuck Off Steven t-shirt, which is about episode number 6, Jesse Valencia. People comment on it constantly and smile and laugh, and it's always so fun wearing that shirt. Anyways, if you haven't checked out the merch shop, take a peek and see if there's anything that you love. I always make it the cheapest that I can. I know nowadays it's rough, but I don't give a shit about any profit from a fucking t-shirt. I just want people to enjoy the humor and let others know that you too love true crime and that we aren't weird. The Hidden Files will make a comeback one day, but for now, if you're interested in hearing what they will be like, you can head over to Patreon and take a listen, and I will keep you guys posted on their return debut when I figure out when that will be. Lastly, help spread the word about TheKillFile by telling a friend or two about the podcast. Encourage them to join us so that we can grow and I can give you guys even more content. And if you're a social media user, follow us on Blue Sky, TikTok, Instagram, and or Facebook. If you're interested in my more personal musings and you want to talk about true crime openly, you can follow my other Facebook page, which is just my name and then TheKillFile after it. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to talk about a serial killer who targeted a community who was just trying to find its footing at the time and whose nickname is the Highway Killer. Trigger warnings for today are going to be homophobia, rape, molestation, murder, dismemberment, and mutilation. Here we go. Today's case is going to take us back in time to the beginning of the 1980s right here in the United States, more specifically Chicago, Illinois. Chicago in the 80s was a city going through a shifting period stuck between racial and economic shifts. Not only was the city seeing earth-shattering strides for the black community when its city's first black mayor, Harold Washington, was elected in 1983, but also something called the Council Wars were ongoing, which was defined as a fierce political dispute between the established city council members and its new administration. This decade was also earmarked by the loss of jobs for some of the west and south sides of the city, when some industrialization was happening. Development was happening downtown as well as in the north side of Chicago, which unfortunately for the lower classes and poverty-stricken would only make matters worse as gentrification was happening around them. Gentrification, for anyone who doesn't know, is when people with money start to move into a specific area, or even when a city will replace or remodel some infrastructure or specific areas, which then attracts wealthier dwellers and more people to the area. In turn, this drives up property value, rent prices, and can even put out smaller businesses as they're replaced by bigger chains moving into the area. While this all sounds like a good thing, the fact that things are being replaced and updated and made nicer, it can actually hurt locals in the fact that they may find themselves having to pay more money for the same living that they're accustomed to with increased property taxes, higher rent, especially if their housing is renovated as well, and can also lead to cultural displacement and social tensions. But not all was lost for the citizens of Chicago, as Michael Jordan would make his debut in the city, joining the Bulls in 1984, which heightened the sports culture in the area. The Chicago Bears also made a big splash in 1985, going a whopping 15-1 in their season, dominating with their explosive defense, defeating their division playoff game and then the NFC Championship with scores of over 20 points to their rivals being blown out, meaning they didn't score anything. And then they finished off the season with their Super Bowl 20 win with a score of 46-10 against the Patriots. On the other hand, the infamous Tylenol murders took place in Chicago as well in 1985, murders that are still unsolved to this day, but shocked and scared the hell out of the nation at the same time. The LGBTQIA+ community in Chicago during this decade was notably significant, with nightlife featuring queer bars in the areas like Boys Town and activists joining the fights against HIV and AIDS during its epidemic. One thing that I found during my research of Chicago during this time period that I found so interesting was the fact that something called the Gerbert Hart Library and Archives was founded in 1981, which had specific space to preserve the records for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender peoples and their organizations, which I thought was so fucking cool. This brings us to the day that many would never forget, August 21st, 1984. At 6 a.m., an apartment complex janitor located on West Sherman Street in Chicago would make a truly disturbing, terrifying, and harrowing discovery. As the man was getting the complex's dumpster ready as it would be emptied in the morning, he saw that it was overflowing with some trash bags that were gray in color. The janitor then began to remove the bags, presumably to move them around and maybe make some more room. As he was doing this, one of the bags dropped out of his hands, and when it hit the ground, a severed human leg fell out. The authorities were called to the scene, whereupon they would horrifically discover that several of the other trash bags contained the dismembered remains of a young teenage boy whose body had been dismembered into 8 pieces. Oh my god, can you imagine? Fuck. As the police made their way to questioning witnesses, a tenant remembered seeing someone who had lived next door putting the trash bags into the dumpster at 3:30 p.m. the day before. How fucking brazen to do it right there in the open and in the late afternoon, right? Not even in the cover of darkness. Jesus. The remains would be identified as belonging to a 15-year-old boy named Danny Bridges. One of the books that I used as a resource for this case is called Freed to Kill, written by Geralind Kollerick with the help of Wayne Klatt, who would describe Danny as a local young man who had somewhat of a troubled past. As Danny was known to hang out in a place called the Galaxy Room, which was like a pool hall / arcade of sorts, but much darker in nature. Known to be frequented by runaways and drug addicts of the local youth, it sat underneath some railroad tracks in a seemingly seedy part of town. Although the area seemed more friendly to locals, it was described as an area full of street gangs, arson, and even neo-fascists. Neo-fascists, for anyone who doesn't know, because I'd heard the word, but I couldn't remember if I knew exactly what it meant. It's like extreme nationalistic views, xenophobia, or fear or distrust of anything or anyone foreign. And neo-fascism is known for extreme far-right ideology and white supremacy. So the area is not great, and to top it off, the book Freed to Kill would state that in this particular area, it would not be abnormal for a family to have one or more children who would participate in sex work. Kids as young as 9 were known to hang out near local supermarket doors, wanting to quote-unquote help men carry things to their cars. If they were just helping with groceries, they may get a quarter for their troubles, but if the man offered the young child a ride in their car, I guess it was called, then the kid could earn between $20 and $50, feeling like they were lucky to get to earn that much, and they would later brag to their friends about the earnings that they had made, and this went for boys and girls alike. I don't know why I didn't know this, but this shit blew my fucking mind. I had no idea that it was so common for kids to be in the sex work trade at such a young age. And in the fucking 80s, what? Did you guys know that? I mean, I've heard the stories of sex slaves or human trafficking, or in some awful cases a mother or parent who would put their children on the streets or whatever, but I did not know that it was common, and I definitely didn't know that kids went out and did this of their own volition. Jesus fuck. This country, no, this entire world is built on the backs of abused children. What in the actual fuck is wrong with us? So Danny Bridges was someone who was known to hang around these types of areas, and Danny was said to have loved to play pinball while some of the other boys around him were busy talking to older men and trying to drum up some business. Danny was described as not particularly handsome, but he was friendly with blonde hair, and people thought him to be seemingly honest and approachable. To the kids on the street, I guess they didn't really think of what they were doing as sex work, per se. The book would go on to describe that children were picked up for a variety of abusive things where they stood in something called Blood Alley. Sometimes they would be given drugs and photographed, or there were described one man who picked them up and had them watch him as he masturbated. But I'm pretty sure that many of them experienced the worst of the worst. But of course, that's just my conjecture. People are known to do these things against children's wills, so I can only imagine what people asked them to do willingly. Danny, unfortunately, had been introduced to a variety of lewd acts when he was just 9 years old, when a neighbor of his had invited Danny to come up to his apartment and then sexually abused the poor boy. The only comments that Danny was said to have made about the incident was that he was quote-unquote almost raped, and that everything happened so fast. The book would describe how Danny would end up seeing these acts of abuse as love. One witness would identify the man as Larry Eyler, who had thrown the gray trash bags into the dumpster, marking Danny Bridges as the 23rd victim of the highway killer. When the authorities raided the home of Eyler around 7 a.m., they would find the killer in bed with his lover, a married man named John Drobovolskis. Sorry if I butchered that. Police arrested Eyler and brought him in for questioning in connection to the murder and dismemberment of Danny Bridges, as the authorities were able to lift fingerprints from the trash bags that matched Eyler. They were also able to find numerous bloodstains in his home, along with other evidence, which included the box of trash bags that matched those that Danny had been found in, a t-shirt known to belong to Danny as well as a hacksaw. Larry Eyler was officially charged with the first-degree murder of the young boy by 8 p.m. that same day. As the style and manner of the murder of Danny matched other victims that had been found, the authorities now believed they had in their custody the serial killer they had been long looking for, a Larry Eyler, aka the Highway Killer. Larry Eyler was born on December 21, 1952 in Crawfordsville, Indiana. He was the youngest of 4 children, and his parents would go on to divorce when he was just 2.5 years old. Some sources would speak to the fact that not only did Eyler's father, but also his stepfathers were known to physically abuse his mother and all of the children. According to All That's Interesting, one stepfather of Eyler reportedly physically disciplined Eyler by submerging his head under scalding hot water. Eyler's mother, Shirley, was said to work as a waitress and a factory worker, but his family was always struggling financially as his mother's income wasn't really enough to support a family of 5. It was said in sources that Larry was raised by one family and his sister Teresa was raised by another, while their mother Shirley raised the 2 older boys. In fact, there came a point where she almost had to give away the 2 older boys to a local orphanage, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. I got the sense from the book that the family kept separating and then coming back together again. It was also stated that Shirley believed her kids needed a strong father figure, so she had married 2 other times after their father, but both marriages were a catastrophe. One source actually said she had been married 3 other times. Larry had increasingly become harder to handle at home, and eventually, as a result of his behavior, his mother would have him seen by a psychologist to have him evaluated. Psychologically, it was found that Eyler was average intelligence and was also said to have a fear of abandonment and severe insecurities. Although these were problems for Eyler, their recommendation was still that Shirley should send him to a home for boys who were unmanageable. This surprised me to know that this child who had been abused and left with all of these different people and families with multiple stepfathers was afraid of being abandoned, which makes sense. His home life isn't stable. But their recommendation was to send the child to a place for unruly children, and yet another action that could be perceived as abandonment by his mother? That makes no fucking sense, and it's really sad. I guess this had a huge impact on Eyler, and not in a good way. The boy seemed to be broken by the separation of his family. Eventually, one of the people who ran the home had asked Shirley to talk to her son, and when she did, Eyler promised his mother that he would be well behaved, and he even offered to always do his chores, seemingly in an effort to be taken home with his family as he was crying. This seemed to pull on Shirley's heartstrings, and they both cried as she accepted him to come back home. When Larry came home, it was almost a year, and friends could tell that he was somewhat different than he had been before he left. He was quieter and more withdrawn than he had been before, giving off the impression that something had happened to him while he was away. Around 8th grade, Eyler was interested in a local girl, and he and his best friend often played chess together. Eyler was said to be, at this time, a likable kid, willing to give anything to anyone who wanted or needed it. He even saved a girl from being embarrassed at a dance when no one was asking her to dance. Eyler did. Eventually, Eyler would drop out of high school at some point and obtain his GED as he was working different odd jobs. He would enroll in college for the first time in 1974, but would end up dropping out to take a job as a security guard at a bank, followed by a job as a guard in a hospital. Although Eyler had enrolled and dropped out of college numerous times, at the end of what would have been a 4-year degree, he didn't have enough credits to graduate, so instead he quit school and ended up moving to Chicago. Eyler would work a variety of jobs, and as his daytime experiences seemed to not really interest him, but as long as he had some kind of job, his nighttime activities are seemingly what he lived for. According to Free to Kill, Eyler was known to call sex hotlines where people called in to make appointments with strangers, and during this time, Eyler would call to make appointments, meet up, and have sex with men. It was said in many sources that during the life and crimes of Larry Eyler, there had seemingly been this internal struggle about the man's sexuality. I guess he was both disgusted with himself for having gay tendencies, but also fascinated with them at the same time. Sources said that although Eyler started to realize around puberty that he was in fact gay, he was only really open about this with his family due to his deep-rooted feelings of hatred towards himself. As Eyler would meet men in bars to have sex with, he wasn't known to have a large group of friends, rather a few that he seemed content with keeping. Eyler would meet his lover in August of 1981, a 20-year-old man named John Dobrovolskis, who was married with children, and the pair seemed to entangle in a relationship where it was stated that Eyler wanted to ensure that he was the only man in John's life. However, in hypocritical fashion, he himself didn't want to feel dependent on John and wanted to be able to have his own relationships, however casual, as well. This led to a love, hate, and jealous relationship between the two where Eyler would cheat, but wanted to make sure that John never did. John was a married man to a woman named Sally, and it seemed that both Sally and John's mother knew that he was bisexual and that Eyler was a good family friend. Eyler was also welcome to live at the family home during the weekdays when he was in town working as a painter. John's wife, Sally, would later talk to law enforcement openly about her like of Eyler. He seemed like a good friend to Sally, and she seemingly had no jealousy about Eyler and John's relationship. As Eyler and John would engage in sadomasochistic sexual activities, including bondage, some torture, or beating as well, it was said that the couple's fights would sometimes lead to John striking Eyler, although Eyler never struck back. Their relationship was one that was permanent in both men's minds and to their family and friends. Before Eyler would go on to meet John, there would be some incidents with people who had sexual encounters with the man. Some would describe how not only was Eyler sadistic in nature, but he was also violent with a hot temper that seemed to only come out during said sexual encounters. Friends of Eyler's, after his final apprehension, would go on to say that he also had a gentle side to him as well. According to an article written about Eyler in the Indianapolis Star from 1984, Eyler had at one point wanted to be a priest and had worked with disabled children. He was known to his friends as someone who had wanted to help people and cared for others, but people who met him in gay bars or had sexual encounters would beg to differ. It almost seemed like a Jekyll and Hyde situation, which is terrifying. So, as I was researching this case and found all sorts of reports of the various murders Eyler committed, before we talk about them, I wanted to find his motive, like what led him to wanting to kill people. What confused me about this case was that Eyler would perform sexual acts with men, and then he turned violent towards them. Now, we've heard of men who were struggling with their own sexuality, and they killed other gay men or targeted them, but the mere fact that this man was known to the gay community and had a long-term boyfriend made no sense to me that his struggling sexuality would be the sole reason for his murders. This is just my opinion, but as we will come to see, he did make a confession. But there is definitely a lack of much motive when it comes to why exactly he chose to murder his victims. Personally, I think there's a lot more going on there besides the fact that he hated himself for being gay. Not when he openly had a boyfriend and was known to frequent gay bars and hook up with others. Although the sexual encounters would later be depicted as sadistic in nature, he would also hang with a crowd that was known to have leather fetishes. While his friends considered him to be an easygoing guy who liked bodybuilding and was close to his sister and mom, some would describe his sinister sexual play in a terrifying manner. Eyler would be described as bludgeoning people during sex, strangling them, or even cutting their bodies with a knife during their engagement, and all the while he would scream profanities at them as well. Around 1974, when Eyler was about 22 years old, is when he would meet a man named Robert David Little, which you will hear a lot about in this case, an older gay man who was about 38 years old. Eyler was said to have moved in with Little, although the pair were known to be strictly platonic. I guess Eyler kind of saw Little as more of a father figure than a mate. Sources said that the two would often go out together to local gay bars, and that because Little was unattractive and socially awkward, he not only had a hard time making or keeping friends, but he also had a hard time picking up other men. Therefore, it was known that Eyler would often pick up a man for the two to share in sexual engagements back at their place. Little seemed to stay in Eyler's life most of the time, paying his bills and providing for him as well as taking trips with him. At one point, Little had signed an application for an apartment for Eyler and bought him some home furnishings for it as well. It was said in many sources that Little and John, which is Eyler's lover, did not care for each other. When Eyler had lived at his own place later on and Little would come to visit, he would have to cancel plans with John and wasn't really able to see him while Little was still in town. It was also known after Eyler was finally caught for the murder of Danny Bridges that Eyler had almost been caught before, even being arrested for attempted murder. One victim that had gotten away from Eyler was an alleged victim named Craig Townsend. After Craig had woken up from his coma in the hospital, he dipped before he could be questioned by the authorities. During the investigation into Eyler, one of the detectives on the case was able to track Craig down, and as the man identified his attacker as Eyler, he recounted his story, according to Freedom to Kill. He would tell the detective that after leaving a construction site that he was currently working at about a year before this, on October 12th, he headed to 2 different gay bars and was drinking, feeling pretty buzzed. After eating at a local restaurant, Craig had seen Eyler in his red truck when Eyler offered him a beer and asked if he wanted to go for a ride. As Craig was drinking a beer riding with Eyler towards Indiana, Eyler was alleged to have given Craig some black-colored pills and told him that they were speed. I thought that speed was always meth, but when I looked this up to make sure, because meth is definitely not black, I guess speed refers to medications that are prescribed for like ADHD. I've always referred to those as uppers. Craig took the pills as he described at the time. He was already feeling pretty good and probably would have taken anything at that point. Craig would tell the detective he took at least 3 of the pills as they were driving, and at some point his mind became foggy. Craig said he did remember that he was kind of fighting with Eyler at one point, but that the next thing he remembered was being in the hospital as he was apparently being treated for being left out in the elements for so long. One source would say severe dehydration as well as intoxication. Craig said that he didn't really know what had happened to him and that he really didn't want to find out, so he got up and got dressed and left without anyone realizing who he was. Only 10 days after this happened to Craig, a 19-year-old boy named Stephen Crockett was found laying dead in the same area that Craig had been left. Stephen Crockett was reportedly stabbed 32 times in a frenzied attack, with 4 of the stabbings sadly and sickeningly to Stephen's head. Both Stephen and Craig had been drugged with something called ethchlorvinol, which is something that had been made in the 50s to help with severe insomnia. Stephen was also found to be the 3rd or 4th victim of the highway killer. Eyler's first attempted murder didn't go exactly as planned. As detailed in the book Free to Kill, Eyler was seemingly out hunting for a victim, if not to kill, then to rape and brutalize. He would pick up a Marine veteran named Mark Henry, who had been out hitchhiking on August 3, 1978, in a place called Terre Haute, Indiana. As the pair drove, at some point, Eyler would proposition Mark, seemingly for sex. Immediately becoming uncomfortable, Mark tried to jump out of the truck, but instead, he was met with a knife that had a staggering 8-inch blade, and it was pointed right at Mark. As Eyler recklessly drove towards an isolated area and stopped, he ordered Mark to get out of the truck as well as take off his shirt. Mark was then handcuffed at knife point and thrown into the back of the truck bed where there was a thin mattress. As Mark's shoes were removed and then his pants, Eyler told Mark to lie on his stomach, where the mattress was noticeably covered in plastic. After Mark had flopped onto his stomach, Eyler tied Mark's ankles together, and this is when Mark would notice that Eyler was now naked and stroking Mark's bare body with the blade of his knife, almost in a ritualistic yet loving way. Mark waited for the right moment to hurriedly flip over to get to the edge of the truck bed and flip backwards onto the ground. He knew that he had to make a run for it before whatever was about to happen happened. Mark awkwardly staggered as his ankle ties were loosening a bit. Mark just wanted to make it to the woods and try his luck at escaping. Eyler caught up to him quickly, and although Mark was still tied and handcuffed, he screamed in Eyler's face, quote, "You fucking queer." Right then, Eyler stabbed Mark in the chest with the long knife, puncturing a lung. Not knowing what to do, Mark fell to the ground, gasping for air, and decided to play dead. After standing over him for a moment, Eyler walked away, not knowing Mark was indeed alive. Mark was able to get his hands up in front of him, untie his ankles, and make his way to a trailer, screaming for help. The people inside were seemingly afraid to open the door, which is understandable. As Mark was screaming he needed something to stop the bleeding, and fell onto the patio in the front. Eventually, barely conscious, he could see the authorities in front of him, covering him with a blanket and telling him to continue talking in an effort to keep him awake. Eventually, someone had made their way to the front of the crowd, saying that some guy had just told him that he stabbed someone and handed the trailer owner the key to the handcuffs to give to the authorities. Eyler had parked behind the officers and was just standing there as they arrested him for the incident. Mark would survive, thankfully, with dozens of stitches internally and outwardly on his body, and as Eyler sat awaiting his case, Mark had intended to testify. As Mark was leaving the hospital, Eyler's lawyer met him in the hallway with a check for $2,500 for the medical bills and his loss of work. For one reason or another, Mark took the check and then agreed not to press charges, and for this reason, the judge was forced to dismiss the charges of aggravated battery against Eyler with prejudice, meaning Mark can't go back later and try to charge him again. Eyler was free. The highway killer was known to have hunting grounds around Wisconsin, Kentucky, Indiana, and even Illinois. Between the years of 1982 and 1984, Larry Eyler would begin to not only pick up young men for sexual encounters, but he was also at this point raping and murdering many of them as well. Sadly, the bodies of at least 21 young men would be found dumped in various areas along the sides of highways or other inconspicuous places like cornfields or under bypasses. Once the authorities were able to put together that these were the murders of one single person, he was dubbed the highway or interstate killer. The MO seemed to be the same in most of the cases, with few exceptions. They would be found deceased, with their underwear down around their ankles, and it would be found that the boys had been sexually assaulted and subjected to sadomasochistic acts as well. The victims would be found bruised, bludgeoned, and stabbed in their torsos. The highway killer was known to take with him usually the victims' wallets and shirts, which I'm sure made it hard to identify the victims for the authorities. In fact, there were many victims that went as John Does for years, and some still aren't identified to this day, the youngest victim being just 14 years old. Mushroom hunters in the area of Petrifying Springs County Park in Kenosha, Wisconsin, would come across a trash bag in the area, opening it to find a nauseating discovery, a human torso. The remains would be figured out to be belonging to an 18-year-old young man named Derek, but sadly the rest of his body was never found. Another victim that Eyler confessed to in a letter that was signed, I was actually able to read the confession letters, and I will link them in the show notes, but Eyler had confessed to killing a black male in his late teens or early 20s. So throughout this case, as I mentioned, there were some victims who remained John Does. However, some of them have since been identified. Even as recent as 2023, they were able to identify the remains of a victim of Eyler's. This set of remains were found near 3 other sets of remains left by Eyler at an abandoned farm in Indiana. The victim was found and later identified in 2023. He was only 16 years old when he was killed. I'm not sure what the laws are on releasing names of underage victims or whatever, so I'm just going to call him K, and you guys can find the links if you're interested in the full names of the victims. Just because this one is new and I'm not really sure how the family may feel, and I want to be respectful, just in case. So the confession that is made by Eyler concerning a young black hitchhiker may be K or could be another set of remains that have since been identified. But Eyler would explain in his confessions that he found out that his longtime boyfriend, John, had hooked up with an ex-lover of his, and he was extremely upset about it. He would then confess when he talked things over with his pal Little, that Little told him that there was one thing that he could do that might make him feel better. Eyler then went out driving and picked up a young man asking if he would allow Eyler to tie him up and perform oral sex on him for $75, to which the young man or boy said sure. Eyler then said he took the victim to the old farmhouse and tried to park where his vehicle wouldn't be seen. As the pair headed up to the farmhouse, Eyler told the victim he would need to tie him to a post or a beam. Eyler then admitted that he tied this victim to the same thing that he tied the, quote, unidentified Caucasian male to, end quote. Eyler then blindfolded the victim with an ace bandage, tied together his feet, and duct taped his mouth shut. After this, he would pull the victim's pants down to about his knees. And in his confession, Eyler would say, after this, quote, I said, okay, motherfucker, make your peace with God. After waiting 4 or 5 minutes, I stabbed him repeatedly in the stomach and chest, end quote. Eyler then described how the victim slumped forward, and this is when he knew he was dead. He then cleaned up the scene, taking his wallet with him, and threw it out of a window, after which he called Little to talk about it. While on the phone, Little asked Eyler if he groaned or grunted. Yeah, Eyler ends up implicating his friend Dave Little in some of the murders as an accomplice, to which Little was later arrested. I will talk more about this in a moment. Eyler said that he then headed to the hospital because he had cut his own hand during the stabbing of the victim and he believed he had gotten stitches. After this, he proceeded to make a grave for his victim. But then fucking said that as he was going to make a grave for this one, he separated him from the other 3 graves that he had dug, saying, quote, I separated him from the other 3 bodies because I did not think it was proper to bury this person next to the other 3 Caucasian men, end quote. Oh, what a fucking piece of shit. How dare he victimize and murder these young men, but then he has the fucking audacity to bury him in a segregated fashion. What, like this victim didn't mean as much as the others? God damn it, that pisses me off. I fucking hate him. So this next murder that Eyler confessed to involved Dave Little, and it's pretty graphic, so fair warning, but this will give us not only the insight to just how cold and matter-of-factly Eyler described his killings and his victims in his confessions, but also the kinds of murders he committed. The highway murderer, aka Larry Eyler, would confess to murdering 21 young men and or teenage boys in the matter of just a few years. Although he would confess to murdering 17 of them alone and being quote-unquote worse than Dave Little, he would implicate his dear friend in some of the murders, not because he wished him any ill will, but rather in the spirit of wanting to be completely honest. One thing that was known about the highway killer was the fact that as the murders had progressed, so did the level of violence and brutality. What may have started out as rape mixed with some violence would eventually progress to bludgeoning, mutilating, and even disemboweling. One murder that was confessed to involved Little and a victim that Little had found himself, in fact. Eyler would describe an incident where the victim was between the ages of 20 and 25 and was out their townhouse with Little when Eyler returned from Greencastle. He would describe how Little was in the bedroom with the victim for a while before coming out and saying that he had talked the victim into doing a quote-unquote wild scene. They wanted to take this man towards the farmhouse outside of Lake Village, seemingly the same area Eyler had taken his other victims as well. Eyler would describe how he would bring the shirts of his victims to Dave Little, which explains why their t-shirts were gone. Little then told Eyler to go grab the, quote, murder bag out of the garage, end quote. Little told Eyler that he was going to bring his camera, and as the 3 of them drove off, Eyler gave the victim a beer and tried to offer him the sleeping drugs as well. However, Little told him no. Little then pulled out a $100 bill, telling the victim that they wanted something really far out for what they were about to do. He then explained they wanted to tie the victim up to a post, and while one of them would perform oral sex on the victim, the other would take pictures. The victim wasn't sure about this, but after Little told them that they would pay him the $100, the victim relented, saying okay, and that they needed the money. After finding a spot to tie the victim to, Eyler retrieved the rope out of the murder bag, as Little set up some flashlights so they could see the victim and what they were doing. Eyler quickly tied the victim's feet with rope, handcuffed him, and wrapped duct tape around his head, presumably to hold the victim to the post or whatever, because he then said he used an ace bandage to cover his eyes. Eyler then said Little had already started masturbating and telling Eyler to make sure to get his eyes. The victim was holding still at first, seemingly not exactly aware that anything horrible was about to happen, until Little told Eyler to stand next to the victim with the knife against his bare stomach and to pull up his shirt. This is about the time the victim started to understand something was off and was struggling a bit when Eyler was trying to take off his shirt. Little started taking pictures of what was going on, instructing Eyler to pull the victim's pants down, as Little was still snapping pictures, telling Eyler what to do. This is when Little said, quote, okay, kill the motherfucker. Eyler would describe how the victim really started to squirm, now hearing this, of course, and this disturbingly excited Little even more. Eyler said he told the victim the same line as the other victim about making their peace with God before he started stabbing the victim over and over. Eyler described how the victim's blood was everywhere when Little came over quickly, took the knife, and started stabbing the victim until the victim slumped over. Little then instructed Eyler to take him down, where Eyler removed the tape, handcuffs, and removed the blindfold. Little again started masturbating, and although Eyler said he was already exhausted, he knew his buddy wanted more, so Eyler again started stabbing the already seemingly deceased victim for Little's enjoyment. This is when Little would tell Eyler that they needed to cut off the victim's head and hands so that he couldn't be identified, Little stating that he didn't want the victim connected to him, which made me wonder if he already knew him. Eyler said the next part is foggy in his mind, but that they did remove the victim's head and hands with a hacksaw and a knife, and put those parts in trash bags, and found a dumpster to put them in. Little then took the photos to be developed at a place that I guess said they didn't care what they developed, and then Little would later use the photos and the clothing of victims to masturbate to. After the murder, Little gave Eyler money, as he usually did, taking care of him, always. Yeah, it's fucking brutal. Not only is this just the most disgusting thing ever, but the way that he casually talks about decapitating the victim and removing his hands is just so gruesome. Also, what in the actual fuck is wrong with those people who developed these fucking pictures? Are you kidding me? Did they just not see what they were developing, or did they see it and just not give a shit? Because that person or those people, in my mind, should be charged with something like obstruction of justice or some shit like that for not reporting anything. That's fucking disgusting. What I don't understand is that although Dave Little was arrested at some point for being implicated in the murders, he was eventually acquitted. During my research, I found that not only did Eyler testify against Little, and even took polygraphs that he passed when it came to the fact that Little was an accomplice in some of the murders, but the FBI's profile, according to one source, talked about how the highway murderer they said was a muscular young man who was violently conflicted about being gay, but that also he sometimes was joined by a second killer, stating the second person was most likely more mature, educated, and maybe a respected male from the community who was, quote, using the killer's youth to ensnare victims for perverse sexual gratification, end quote. Eyler was arrested on suspicion of being the highway murderer, and after a search of Little and Eyler's place, they found a ton of circumstantial evidence that led them to believe that Eyler was their man, and they tried to charge him with some of the murders. The authorities knew that this was their man due to receipts, times and places, etc., even though this was before the murder of Danny Bridges. However, after the charges were brought, it was found out not only had Eyler not been properly Mirandized, but that much of the evidence the authorities found was found illegally and without warrants. Therefore, the judge was forced to let Eyler go, and although they knew that he had killed young men and boys, Eyler, again, was free. This was until he committed his last murder, the murder of Danny Bridges. The authorities, in this case when it came to the collection of evidence, must know that the blood of at least Danny is on their hands for not following the letter of the law when it comes to how to do their jobs properly. I mean, it's so frustrating that not being Mirandized properly is even a fucking factor or the search warrant crap, but it is what it is, and they should know better. They are technically responsible for this known murderer going free. When it came to the discovery of Danny's dismembered remains, this time the authorities made sure to follow the proper channels so that the charges would stick. Because Eyler had spent so much money on a proper defense when it came time to the initial charges of murder, where he was eventually let go, he didn't have the funds to do it again. He instead had to use public defenders in the murder of Danny Bridges. After being convicted of murder and aggravated kidnapping in October of 1986, Larry Eyler was then sentenced to death by Judge Joseph Urso, saying, quote, "If there ever was a person the death penalty is appropriate, it's you. You are an evil person. You truly deserve to die for your acts," end quote. Highly agreed, Judge, and I love hearing what they have to say after the trials are over. And I also wonder how often they feel like the jury got it wrong, but they just have to keep their mouth shut. That would be so hard. So after the conviction of Eyler, he was sent off to death row, but victims were still coming up found, and at some point, Eyler's lawyer came up to the then DA, saying that Eyler would like to discuss the murders of 20 victims with the DA and he would confess and testify against David Little in exchange for life in prison, being taken off death row. The lawyer also said that there was a chance that his death sentence would be overturned upon appeal, and further, that Eyler could be found not guilty during the next trial. And if I remember correctly, it's because Eyler could be found complicit in a murder, but maybe wasn't the one who actually murdered Bridges, presumably saying David Little did. One source said the DA didn't want to reward Eyler for talking about the murders that he had committed, but at the same time, they could close 20 murder cases and potentially take another murderer off the street while still letting Eyler rot in prison for the rest of his life. Ultimately, the DA, in a bold move, said that they were rejecting the deal and that they got Eyler for the murder of Bridges and he was put on death row, which is what they wanted, and they didn't want to give that up. When Eyler first put out the offer, he gave the DA a deadline to accept, and he said that if they didn't accept, that he would then take his secrets to the grave. However, as he was on death row, there was mounting evidence against Eyler pertaining to one victim, and this time Eyler agreed to confess to that particular murder and testify against Little in return for a sentence of 60 years, and Little was arrested for the murder. After Eyler testified against Little, during cross-examination, the defense did a good job of making it seem like the only reason that Eyler implicated Little and agreed to testify against him was out of revenge, since Little had testified against Eyler. And since there wasn't any physical proof that Little did anything wrong, he was ultimately acquitted. Turns out, at this time, Eyler's confession letters to the rest of his murders were only in the hands of his lawyer. He didn't confess to the authorities about them. While Eyler was on death row, he was diagnosed as having AIDS, and he would end up dying on March 6, 1994, from complications of the disease. Upon his death was the release of his confessions to the murders. And although I hate this motherfucker with a passion for killing innocent young men and boys for being gay just as he was, I'm thankful he confessed to the rest of the murders for closure for the families, even if it was pretty late. There are so many murderers out there who take everything to their graves and without any confessions, and people are left wondering for life. So, there's that. And that, my friends, is the story of the highway murderer, Larry Eyler. Sadist, rapist, murderer, and all-around disgusting piece of shit human being. First off, let me just say that I couldn't include all of the information that's out there about this case. If you even just check out the Wikipedia page on this man, you will find it full of resources where you can learn more about this case. As horrible as it is one of the more fascinating cases that I have covered in my own personal opinion. Not because of the gruesome murders, that part is horrific and harrowing, and I feel so badly for the victims' families. Those boys and men did not deserve that in the least. But to me, what I found so interesting is the fact that he was willing to confess to the murders and implicate his accomplice further, and not just an accomplice in my personal opinion. This David Little guy is also a murderer and deserves to be in prison. I saw that it said following his acquittal, he went back to teaching at Indiana University, which blows my fucking mind. Can you imagine being a student of this fuckers? I mean, if I'm wrong, then I'm sorry, but there seemed to be a lot of evidence against him, and it seemed like it came as a shock that this man was acquitted of the murder charges. I just can't understand it, but there's a ton of information out there on this guy as well, and a lot more than I could include. I was also able to find that John, Eyler's lover, unfortunately also died from AIDS in 1990 when he was only 29. He was also said to have testified against Eyler, which I think I want to go back and learn even more about, because as I said, there are still victims unidentified, which means we may still hear this man come up in the news as his victims are hopefully identified. I tried to find out if Dave Little is still alive or what happened to him, but I couldn't. I think there's also some shows about these murders that were either inspired by or they cover some of the cases committed by Eyler if you guys are interested. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this fucked up case as much as I did, and remember to be alright with your own sexuality. It's okay to be who you are, and fuck the haters. You're not alone. Come on back next Monday when we will cover another case here on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Alright guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help the podcast grow and other true crime lovers to find us. Also, check out the website, TheKillFile.com, where you can suggest a case, find our merch shop, and submit a listener file. Follow The Kill File on your favorite social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. Of course, you can always subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.